Welcome to Life Stories, where every tale is a journey of resilience, love, and the unexpected twists of fate. On a freezing New Year's night, a nurse stumbles upon a man left for dead in a snowstorm. He has no name, no past, only a shattered memory and a dangerous truth waiting to be uncovered. As she helps him piece together his lost identity, they uncover a web of betrayal, power, and second chances. Who is he, and why was he left to die? Subscribe now to Life Stories and join us as we unravel today's gripping tale. New Year's Eve had never felt lonelier. The streets of Chicago were almost deserted, buried under layers of fresh snow. The streetlights barely managed to pierce through the swirling white veil, their glow casting eerie halos on the icy pavement. Inside my old sedan, the heater hummed softly, fighting an unwinnable battle against the cold. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles white under the dim dashboard light. It had been a long shift at the hospital, 12 hours of exhaustion, heartbreak, and helplessness. Nursing was supposed to be about saving lives. But tonight, it had felt like an endless cycle of patching wounds I could never truly heal. A young mother who had lost her newborn. An elderly man clutching my hand with teary eyes as he took his last breath. Pain was all around me, and I had nothing left to give. I sighed, whispering to myself, almost home. Emily, just a few more blocks. Home. The thought was barely comforting. My sister, Sarah, was probably asleep on the couch, the television still blaring some old holiday film. The warmth of knowing someone was waiting for me should have been enough. But a familiar restlessness sat heavy in my chest. New beginnings, fresh starts. The promises of the new year rang hollow, drowned out by the weight of another year spent running on empty. Snowflakes pelted against the windshield, blurring the road ahead. I slowed down, my tires skidding slightly on an unseen patch of ice. That was when I saw it, a faint glint of metal, barely visible through the storm. A car. The vehicle lay half buried in a snowdrift, tilted at a dangerous angle in a ditch. I hesitated, my foot hovering over the brake. Common sense told me to keep driving. This wasn't a safe place to stop, not in the middle of a blizzard, and I had no idea what kind of trouble might be waiting for me. But something, a quiet instinct, perhaps, kept me from looking away. I inched forward, my headlights illuminating the wreck. The windshield was shattered, a web of cracks spreading across the glass. Steam hissed from the crumpled hood, merging with the blizzard in ghostly spirals. My stomach twisted. Someone could be inside. Someone could be dying. Damn it, I muttered, shoving the gear into park. The moment I stepped out, the storm hit me like a wall. The wind howled, biting through my coat and stinging my skin like tiny needles. I pushed forward, my boots crunching against the fresh snow as I approached the car. I knocked hard on the driver's side window. Hey, can you hear me? No response. Peering through the frost-covered glass, I could just make out a dark silhouette slumped against the seat. My pulse quickened. A man, motionless. A faint trickle of blood stained his temple, stark against his pale skin. He was unconscious. Maybe worse. Okay, Emily. You can do this. The door wouldn't budge, frozen shut by the ice. Swallowing my panic, I braced my shoulder against it, shoving with all my strength. The metal groaned under the pressure, ice cracking along the edges until, finally, it gave way. A gust of bitter, frozen air rushed out, nearly taking my breath with it. I reached in, my fingers trembling as I searched for a pulse. Faint, but there. You're alive, I murmured, relief mingling with urgency. Up close, the man looked out of place in this wreckage. His coat was expensive, the fabric rich beneath my fingertips. A faint scent of leather and something deeper, cologne, maybe, clung to him. Even the watch on his wrist, glinting in the dim light, whispered of wealth and privilege. Yet here he was, broken and alone in the middle of a storm. Getting him out was harder than I expected. His body was dead weight, his limbs unresponsive. The wind fought me at every turn, snow soaking through my jeans, my fingers going numb. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. By the time I managed to get him into the passenger seat of my car, My breath came in gasps. My body trembling from exertion. Slamming the door shut, I collapsed into the driver's seat. My hands shaking as I cranked the heater to full blast. For the first time, I allowed myself a moment to look at him. He was young, maybe in his early 30s. Strong jawline, dark hair tousled from the wind. A few days' worth of stubble shadowing his face. He might have been handsome, if not for the deep furrow of pain on his brow. His chest rose and fell. Shallow but steady, the only reassurance I had that he was still fighting. Who was he? What was he doing out here alone? The questions piled up, unanswered, but they would have to wait. Right now, there was only one priority: getting us both out of this storm alive. Gripping the wheel, I forced my car back onto the icy road. My knuckles just as pale as before. The wind screamed louder, as if the storm itself had noticed my passenger, and wasn't done with him yet. The drive home was tense. The storm had only gotten worse. And my old sedan struggled against the wind as if the car itself wanted to give up. My hands were clenched around the wheel. My foot light on the gas. Careful not to skid on the ice-slicked roads. Every few seconds, my eyes flicked to the unconscious man beside me. He hadn't stirred since I dragged him into the car. His breathing was steady, but shallow. The cut on his temple had stopped bleeding. But the bruise beneath was already deepening, a dark, ominous mark against his pale skin. He looked like someone who had never been this vulnerable before. Like a man who was used to control, now stripped of it entirely. "Who the hell are you?" I murmured, my voice barely audible over the sound of the heater struggling against the cold. Of course, he didn't answer. The streets of Chicago were empty, blanketed in thick snow, the city's usual heartbeat muffled under winter's cruel grip. When I finally pulled into the driveway of my small townhouse, I exhaled a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Getting him inside was another challenge. He was dead weight, barely reacting as I heaved him out of the car. His arm draped over my shoulders. The snow swirled around us, the wind howling through the empty streets. My fingers burned from the cold as I fumbled with my keys. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Sarah was going to kill me. I managed to get the door open and practically stumbled inside with him. The warmth of the house hitting me like a shock. The sudden shift from the brutal cold made my muscles ache. But there was no time to rest. I led him to the couch, lowering him down as gently as I could. His head lolled slightly, but he didn't wake. His breathing was still even, his chest rising and falling in that same slow, steady rhythm. I stepped back, taking a deep breath. The man looked completely out of place in my home, a stranger draped in expensive clothing. His face still locked in that quiet pain. The flickering light of the lamp cast shadows across his features, making him seem even more mysterious. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know if he was dangerous. But I did know one thing. I couldn't just leave him out there to die. "Emily?" I turned sharply, my pulse jumping. Sarah stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her dark eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. Her hair was still messy from sleep, her oversized sweater slipping off one shoulder. "What the hell is this?" she asked, her voice sharp. I hesitated, glancing back at the unconscious man. How was I supposed to explain this? "I found him in a wreck," I said finally, my voice quieter than I intended. "In the storm. He was unconscious, bleeding. I couldn't just leave him there." Sarah sighed, rubbing a hand over her face. "Emily, this is insane. You don't even know who he is. What if?" I checked. "He doesn't have a weapon. He's not dangerous. He needs help." "Sarah," she groaned, pacing for a moment before finally throwing her hands up in surrender. "Fine, but if he wakes up and turns out to be a serial killer?" "I'm saying I told you so." I exhaled in relief. Sarah grabbed a blanket and tossed it over the man before stepping back. She studied him for a moment, her brows furrowed in concern despite her usual tough exterior. "Who do you think he is?" she asked. I shook my head. "I don't know. But something told me we were about to find out." The storm raged on through the night. I barely slept. Every so often, I'd check on the stranger, half expecting him to wake up in a fit of panic, or not wake up at all. But he remained still, his breath steady but shallow, his body lost in whatever battle his mind was fighting. Sarah had gone back to bed, though not without a few warnings about locking my door just in case our guest turned out to be trouble. I didn't blame her. Bringing home an unconscious man from a wreck wasn't exactly my smartest decision. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than just bad luck. By morning, the storm had finally eased. The first rays of pale winter sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of the living room, casting soft golden light over the modest space. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the old radiator struggling against the morning chill. I sat curled in the armchair by the window, a mug of lukewarm coffee in my hands, watching the stranger. Then, he stirred. It was small at first, a twitch of his fingers, a faint crease between his brows. Then, with a low, pained groan, his eyes fluttered open. I set my mug down and rose to my feet. He blinked, his gaze unfocused at first, darting around the unfamiliar room. The tension in his shoulders was immediate, like an animal waking up in a trap. His body coiled and ready to fight. "You're awake," I said softly. His head turned toward me, his hazel eyes sharp but filled with confusion. His lips parted, as if he wanted to speak, but no words came. I took a cautious step forward. "Can you hear me? Do you know where you are?" He tried to sit up but winced instantly, his hand flying to his side. Pain. He was in worse shape than I thought. "Easy," I said, holding up my hands. "You were in an accident. I found your car in the storm last night. You're safe here." He blinked again, his breathing uneven, as if he was trying to grasp the words. Then, after a long pause, he finally spoke. "An accident?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. I nodded. "Yeah, I pulled you out of the wreck. Do you remember what happened?" His jaw tightened. He looked away for a moment, his fingers absently brushing against the watch on his wrist, a small but deliberate movement. Then he exhaled sharply and shook his head. "I don't," he admitted, frustration lacing his tone. "I don't remember anything." My stomach sank. Amnesia. I had seen it before. Patients waking up in the hospital after trauma. Their memories fogged, some lost forever, but seeing it in front of me, in this man who had no idea who he was or why someone had left him for dead in the snow, it felt like something else entirely. "You don't remember your name?" I asked gently. He hesitated, his eyes darkening with something I couldn't quite place. "No," he said finally. I swallowed hard. Whatever had happened to him, it wasn't just an accident. Something told me this man's past was a lot more dangerous than either of us realized. Silence settled over the room, thick with uncertainty. The man, this stranger without a name, sat stiffly on the couch, his fingers still resting on the expensive watch on his wrist. It was a small gesture, but I didn't miss it, as if the watch was the only thing tethering him to a world he no longer recognized. I sat across from him on the coffee table, keeping my voice low, steady. "It's okay," I said. "Memory loss can happen after trauma. It's probably temporary." He let out a slow breath, his jaw clenched tight. Frustration, fear. I recognized those emotions in the way his shoulders tensed, in the way his eyes flickered with something unreadable. I knew that feeling well, the helplessness of not having answers. "Try to think," I continued gently. "Anything at all. A name, a place, a person." He exhaled sharply, his fingers pressing against his temples. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, finally, he spoke. "There was a man," he said slowly, his voice raw. I can't see his face, but I hear his voice. I leaned in slightly. What was he saying? The man swallowed, his expression darkening. That I was reckless, ungrateful. His fingers curled into a fist, like I didn't understand what was at stake. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver through me. The words weren't just echoes of a lost memory, they carried weight. Resentment, a history. "Do you think this man hurt you?" I asked carefully. His eyes met mine, and for a split second, I saw something flicker there, something sharp, something real, but then it was gone. swallowed by confusion once more. I don't know. His voice was quieter now. I don't even know if he was family. But, he controlled everything. Like he was the one pulling all the strings. My stomach twisted. Whoever this man was running from, it wasn't just bad luck. Someone had wanted him off the road. Someone had wanted him gone. Before I could press further, the front door swung open. Sarah stepped inside, shaking snow off her jacket. Her eyes immediately locking onto the man on the couch. Her usual sharp, calculating gaze flicked between us. Suspicion written all over her face. I see our guest is finally awake, she said dryly. The man straightened slightly but said nothing. Sarah turned to me, crossing her arms. You didn't answer your phone. I sighed. The signal's been bad because of the storm. Sarah shot me a look before glancing back at the stranger. And I assume he still doesn't remember anything? I shook my head. Nothing. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, suddenly, her sharp gaze landed on the watch on his wrist. That's an expensive piece, she muttered. His clothes too. He's not just some guy who got stranded in a snowstorm. I swallowed. She wasn't wrong. Whoever this man was, whoever he had been before the crash, he wasn't just an ordinary stranger. And something told me, his past was about to catch up with him. The night was calm, the storm long gone, but inside me, the storm of the past few days still echoed, heavy and unresolved. Michael, because that was his name, we had finally learned, stood beside me on the balcony, overlooking the Chicago skyline. The city lights stretched far beyond us, glittering like 1,000 possibilities. A future that had once been stolen from him. Raymond had been arrested, his crimes exposed for the world to see. The empire he had built on deception and greed had finally crumbled beneath the weight of the truth. Justice had been served, but Michael knew his battle wasn't over yet. He took a deep breath, his hands gripping the balcony railing. For so long, I felt like a stranger in my own life. He murmured, but now, I know who I am. And I know what I have to do. I turned to him, my heart lighter than it had been in days. You don't have to do it alone, I said softly. He glanced at me, a flicker of something warm in his eyes. I know. For the first time since I found him in that snowstorm. He looked at peace, as the first firework lit up the sky. A new year began, not just on the calendar, but in our lives. A story of betrayal, loss, and second chances. A reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest storms, fate has a way of leading us exactly where we need to be. Subscribe to Life Stories to hear more unforgettable tales of love, resilience, and the power of the human spirit.